Yuna pressed her face closer to the glowing screen in the Academy library. Her crystalline fingers moved quickly across the keyboard as she searched through thousands of files. The Galactic Diplomatic Academy had the biggest collection of peace treaty records in known space. She needed to find something special for her final paper. The library was quiet except for the soft hum of computers. Most students had gone back to their rooms hours ago, but Yuna loved working late. Her crystal-like skin caught the blue light from the screen, making small rainbows dance across her study table. She had been looking for 3 hours now. Every file seemed the same. Trade disputes, border conflicts, resource wars, all solved the same boring way by the same boring species. The Altarians used logic. The Centaurians used careful planning. The Vegans used emotion reading. Nothing new or interesting? Yuna rubbed her tired eyes and was about to give up when something caught her attention. At the very bottom of the search results was a file with a strange name. It simply said, Human Involvement Level 9 Classification. She had never heard of humans before. The file was marked with more security warnings than she had ever seen. Red letters flashed across the screen saying, Restricted access and authorization required. Below that were even more warnings in languages she did not recognize. Yuna felt her heart beat faster. In 4 years at the Academy, she had never found anything this secret. She tried to click on the file, but a loud alarm sound came from her computer. The screen turned red and showed a message saying, Security alert, unauthorized access attempt, student ID 4471, professor notification sent. Oh no, Yuna whispered. She quickly closed all her programs and grabbed her study materials. But as she stood up, she saw 3 familiar faces walking toward her table. Kiwan arrived first. His forearms moved in different directions as he organized his notes, checked his watch, and waved at her all at the same time. His green skin was pale, which meant he was worried. Yuna, we got emergency messages on our study group chat, Kiwan said. Something about a security alert? Behind him came Nari, moving slowly like she always did. Her large purple eyes seemed sad as she looked at Yuna. Being an empath meant Nari could feel other people's emotions, and right now she was feeling Yuna's fear and excitement mixed together. You found something, didn't you? Nari asked softly. I can feel it. You're scared but also very curious. The last member of their study group was Do-hyun. His skin was covered in small lights that changed colors based on his mood. Right now the lights were flashing bright orange, which meant he was excited about trouble. What did you do? Do-hyun asked with a big smile. Security alerts are the best kind of alerts. Did you hack into something good? Before Yuna could answer, a deep voice spoke from behind them. Miss Yuna, I believe you and I need to have a conversation. They all turned to see Professor Tae-hyun walking toward them. He was very old, even for an Arcturian. His people lived for thousands of years, and Professor Tae-hyun had been teaching at the Academy for over 3 centuries. He had 6 eyes arranged in 2 rows on his long face, and right now all of them looked serious. Professor, I can explain, Yuna started to say. I am sure you can, Professor Tae-hyun said, but not here. Please follow me, all of you. The 4 students looked at each other nervously. They had never been in trouble together before. Usually when one of them did something wrong, the others tried to stay out of it. But Professor Tae-hyun had asked all of them to come. They walked through the empty halls of the Academy. Their footsteps echoed off the metal walls. The Academy was built on a space station, so there were no windows showing stars or planets. Just long corridors with doors leading to classrooms and offices. Professor Tae-hyun led them to a part of the Academy Yuna had never seen before. They went down several levels and through doors that required special keycards to open. Finally, they stopped in front of a heavy metal door with no markings on it. Before we go in, Professor Tae-hyun said, I need to know exactly what you found, Miss Yuna. It was just a file name, Yuna said. Something about humans. I had never heard of humans before, so I was curious. Professor Tae-hyun's 6 eyes all blinked at the same time. He seemed to be thinking very hard about something. Professor, Kiwan said carefully, what are humans? That is a very dangerous question, Professor Tae-hyun replied. And the answer is why this door exists. He placed his hand on a scanner next to the door. There was a soft beep and the door slid open. Inside was a small room with comfortable chairs arranged in a circle. The walls were covered with screens and storage units. Please sit down, Professor Tae-hyun said. What I am about to tell you is not taught in any class at this academy. It is not written in any textbook. Most professors do not even know this story exists. The student sat down slowly. Nari's empathic abilities were making her feel more and more nervous. She could sense that Professor Taehyun was carrying the weight of something very heavy and very sad. 50 years ago, Professor Taehyun began, humans were considered the greatest peacemakers in the galaxy. They could solve conflicts that had lasted for centuries. They could make enemies become friends in just days. They were so good at creating peace that every species wanted them to help solve their problems. Do-hyun's lights turned from orange to blue, which meant he was confused. That sounds wonderful. Why is it secret? Professor Taehyun walked to one of the storage units and placed his hand on another scanner. The unit opened, revealing shelves full of data crystals and old paper documents. Because, he said, we learned that there are some things worse than war, some prices too high to pay for peace, some gifts too dangerous to accept. He pulled out a thick folder marked with symbols none of the students recognized. The humans were not banned from peace negotiations because they were bad at making peace. Professor Taehyun continued. They were banned because they were too good at it. And when you understand what that means, you will never look at the word peace the same way again. Yuna felt her crystal skin grow cold. What did they do? Professor Taehyun sat down in the chair across from them and opened the folder. Inside were photographs, documents, and reports that looked very old. They gave us exactly what we asked for, he said. Perfect peace, universal harmony, an end to all conflict. And in doing so, they nearly destroyed everything that makes us who we are. The room became very quiet. The only sound was the soft hum of the space station's life support systems. Are you sure you want to know this story? Professor Taehyun asked. Once you learn the truth about humans, you cannot unknown it. It will change how you see our entire civilization. The four students looked at each other. Yuna thought about going back to her room and forgetting about the mysterious file. It would be safer, easier, but she had always been too curious for her own good. We want to know, she said. Professor Taehyun nodded, sadly, and opened the first document in the folder. Then let me tell you about the species that taught us to fear peace itself. Professor Taehyun picked up the first document from the folder. It was yellow with age and had a picture of a strange creature on the front page. The creature stood on 2 legs and had only 2 arms. Its skin was pink and smooth with no scales, fur, or crystals. Most unusual of all, it had only 2 small eyes. This is what humans look like, Professor Taehyun said, showing them the picture. They come from a planet called Earth in a small solar system, far from the galactic center. When we first met them 200 years ago, nobody thought they were special. Do-hyun's lights flickered with interest. They looked so plain. No natural weapons, no armor, no extra arms or eyes. That is exactly what everyone thought, Professor Taehyun agreed. The first contact team reported that humans seemed weak and unremarkable. They had only basic space travel technology. Their planet was small and not very rich in resources. The Galactic Federation almost decided they were not worth including in our alliance. He turned to the next page, which showed a human in formal clothing standing next to several alien diplomats. But then something interesting happened. The human ambassador, a woman named Jihan, was invited to observe a trade dispute between the Rigelians and the Centaurians. This dispute had been going on for 6 months. Both sides had spent millions of credits on legal fees. The mediators were ready to declare the situation hopeless. Kiwon leaned forward, his 4 arms folded with interest. What kind of dispute? Mining rights to an asteroid belt, Professor Taehyun explained. The Rigelians claimed they found it first. The Centaurians said they had mapped it years earlier. Both sides had evidence. Both sides had lawyers. Both sides were completely convinced they were right. Nari closed her large purple eyes and tried to feel the emotions left behind in the old documents. I can sense frustration, lots of anger, and pride. Both sides were too proud to back down. Exactly right, Professor Taehyun said. Ambassador Jihan sat quietly in the corner for 3 days, just watching and listening. She did not speak or ask questions. The other diplomats almost forgot she was there. He turned to another page showing a transcript of the negotiations. Then, on the 4th day, Ambassador Jihan stood up and asked to speak. The mediator was annoyed but agreed to let her say something. And do you know what she said? The students shook their heads. She said, "Has anyone actually been to this asteroid belt to see what is there? Yuna blinked her crystal eyes in confusion. That seems like an obvious question. You would think so, Professor Taehyun said with a sad smile. But in 6 months of negotiations, nobody had thought to ask it. The Rigelians and Centaurians had been fighting over survey data and old maps. Ambassador Jihan suggested they send a joint expedition to actually look at the asteroids. Do-hyun's lights turned yellow with anticipation. What did they find? The asteroid belt was empty. It had been mined out by pirates decades earlier. There was nothing left to fight over. The room was quiet for a moment as the students processed this information. The two sides had spent millions of credits and 6 months fighting over nothing. Professor Taehyun continued. Ambassador Jihan had solved their problem in 5 minutes by asking a simple question that nobody else thought to ask. Kiwon was taking notes with 2 of his hands while the other 2 gestured as he spoke. That is good thinking, but not really amazing. Any smart mediator could have thought of that. That is what everyone said at the time, Professor Taehyun agreed. So the Federation decided to test the humans further. They were invited to help with more disputes. Small ones at first. He pulled out another document, this one with multiple photos and charts. The next case was a border conflict between the Vegan colonies and the Draconian Empire. This dispute had lasted for 50 years. Millions of people had died in border wars. The hatred between the two sides was so deep that they could barely be in the same room together. Nari shuddered. As an empath, she could imagine how terrible that much hatred would feel. The Federation sent their best mediators, Professor Taehyun continued. Teams of specialists who had studied both cultures for years. They worked for 18 months and made no progress. The Vegans and Draconians would not even agree on what language to use for the negotiations. He showed them a picture of a human man in a simple gray suit standing between 2 groups of angry-looking aliens. Then, they sent Ambassador Seojin. He was young for a human, maybe 40 years old. He had never dealt with Vegans or Draconians before. He knew nothing about their history or culture. How could someone with no experience help? Yuna asked. That is what everyone wondered, Professor Taehyun said. Ambassador Seojin arrived on the space station where the negotiations were being held. He spent 1 day reading reports. Then he did something that shocked everyone. The professor paused dramatically, looking at each student. He canceled the formal negotiations. Instead, he invited both sides to have dinner with him. Do-hyun's lights flashed bright red. Dinner? That was his big plan? It seemed foolish, Professor Taehyun agreed. The Vegan delegates were insulted. They said their people were dying while he wanted to eat food. The Draconian delegates were angry too. They said he was not taking the conflict seriously. What did he do then? Nari asked. He smiled and said, You are both right. This is too serious for formal meetings. When something is really important, you should eat together. Food brings truth. Professor Taehyun turned to a page covered with handwritten notes. Ambassador Seojin prepared the meal himself. He made simple food that both species could eat safely. Nothing fancy or expensive. Just good basic food. And while they ate, he asked them to tell him about their families. Their families? Kiwon asked. What did that have to do with the border conflict? Everything, Professor Taehyun said quietly. The Vegan delegate, a mother named Lyra, talked about her daughter who lived near the border. She was afraid every day that the fighting would reach her daughter's school. The Draconian delegate, a father named Korax, talked about his son who was a soldier on the border. He had not seen his son in 2 years because of the war. Nari's eyes filled with tears. They both just wanted their children to be safe. Ambassador Seojin listened to both of them. Then he said something very simple. So you both want the same thing. You want your children to grow up without fear. Why are you fighting each other instead of working together to make that happen? Professor Taehyun closed the document folder. The 50-year border war ended that night. At a dinner table, because a human helped 2 enemies realize they were both parents who loved their children. The students sat in amazed silence. Finally, Yuna spoke. That is incredible. Humans sound like natural peacemakers. Professor Taehyun's 6 eyes looked very sad. That is what everyone thought, he said. Word spread quickly through the galaxy about the amazing human diplomats. Every species wanted their help. The Federation gave humans more and more important assignments. He pulled out another folder, much thicker than the first one, and that, he said, is when we began to learn the terrifying truth about what humans were really doing. Professor Taehyun opened the thick new folder with careful hands. Inside were dozens of photographs, charts, and reports. The paper looked newer than the previous documents, but there were burn marks and stains on many of the pages. The Orion sector crisis happened 30 years after first contact, he began. It was the closest our galaxy had ever come to total war. 12 different species were involved in a massive conflict over mining rights, trade routes, and old territorial claims. He spread several photographs across the table. They showed destroyed space stations, damaged planets, and fleets of warships facing each other across empty space. The fighting had been going on for 2 years. Professor Taehyun continued. Billions of people had died. Entire solar systems had been evacuated. The galactic economy was collapsing because trade ships were too afraid to travel through Orion space. Yuna studied the pictures. Even her crystal skin could not hide how pale she had become. It looks terrible. It was worse than terrible, Professor Taehyun said. The Federation Council met an emergency session every day for months. Nothing they tried worked. Sanctions, trade restrictions, military threats. The 12 species just kept fighting. Do-hyun's lights were flashing orange and red, showing his excitement and worry. So they called the humans? They had no choice, Professor Taehyun replied. Ambassador Hyejin was sent with a team of human specialists. By this time, humans had solved hundreds of smaller conflicts. Everyone expected them to work their usual magic. He pulled out a group photo showing 5 humans standing together. They looked calm and confident, very different from the worried alien diplomats around them. Ambassador Hyejin brought her best people. Yunya was a strategist who could see patterns in complex situations. Sora was a cultural expert who studied how different species think and behave. Mino specialized in trade negotiations, and Yoon specialized in psychology. Kiwon was writing notes with all 4 hands. 5 humans against a 12-species war. Those were not good odds. That is what everyone thought, Professor Taehyun agreed. The human team arrived at Nexus Station, the same place where we are now. Back then it was much smaller, just a diplomatic outpost near the Orion sector. He showed them a map of the station from 30 years ago. It looked very different, with only a few levels and basic facilities. The other mediators had been trying to get all 12 species to meet in one big conference room. They thought if everyone could just sit down together and talk, they could find a solution. That makes sense, Nari said. When people talk face to face, it is harder to hate each other. That is what the other mediators believed too, Professor Taehyun said. But the humans did something completely different. Instead of one big meeting, they scheduled separate meetings with each species. He pulled out a schedule showing dozens of private appointments. Ambassador Hyejin and her team met with each group alone. They spent hours with each species, asking questions, listening to their complaints, learning about their cultures and histories. The professor's voice became quieter, more serious. But they were not just learning about cultures. They were studying psychology. They were mapping out exactly how each species thought, what they feared, what they wanted, and what would make them change their minds. Do-hyun's lights turned blue with confusion. Is that wrong? Understanding people seems like a good thing. Professor Taehyun was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice sounded very old and tired. Understanding and using are 2 different things, he said. Let me show you what the humans learned about just one species, the Draconians. He pulled out a detailed report marked, Classified, Psychological Profile. The humans discovered that the Draconians were not really angry about mining rights. They were terrified. A plague had killed 30% of their population 5 years earlier. Their military was weak, their economy was broken, and they were afraid other species would see them as easy targets. Nari's empathic abilities let her feel the echoes of fear and desperation in the old documents. They were acting tough because they felt weak inside. Exactly, Professor Taehyun said. But here is what made the humans different from other mediators. Instead of helping the Draconians deal with their fear in a healthy way, the humans decided to use that fear as a tool. He showed them another document, this one written in human handwriting. Strategist Junho wrote in his notes, Draconians respond best to face-saving solutions that make them look strong while giving them what they actually need. Recommend private security guarantees disguised as trade partnerships. Yuna felt her crystal skin growing cold. They figured out how to manipulate the Draconians? Not just the Draconians, Professor Taehyun said grimly. They did this with all 12 species. Look at this report about the Centaurians. He showed them another psychological profile. The Centaurians were fighting because they needed rare metals to build new colony ships. Their homeworld was overcrowded and they were desperate to expand. But they were too proud to admit they needed help. So what did the humans do? Kiwan asked, though his green skin was pale with worry. Cultural expert Sora recommended what she called pride-preserving assistance. She suggested offering the Centaurians a trade deal that was clearly too generous, but framing it as payment for their superior planning skills. This way, they could accept help while still feeling superior. Professor Taehyun continued pulling out profile after profile. Each one showed how humans had studied a species' deepest fears, needs, and desires, and each one showed how they planned to use that knowledge to control behavior. The Vegans were desperate for acceptance after being rejected by several potential allies. The humans planned to offer them symbolic inclusion in meaningless ceremonies, while giving them real concessions in private. The Rigelians were obsessed with efficiency and hated wasting time. The humans designed solutions that seemed logically perfect, but were actually emotionally manipulative. The Altarians, your own species, Yuna, were proud of their rational thinking. The humans planned to present emotional solutions in logical language, making you think you had reasoned your way to decisions that were really based on feelings. Yuna felt sick. Her people prided themselves on logic and clear thinking. The idea that someone could trick them into emotional decisions while making them think they were being logical was deeply disturbing. How did they do all of this so quickly? She asked. Professor Taehyun pulled out a thick manual labeled Human Diplomatic Protocols Classified. This is how, he said. The humans had developed a complete system for psychological manipulation. They called it species-specific behavioral architecture. It was like a cookbook for controlling entire civilizations. He opened the manual to show pages covered with charts, diagrams, and formulas. They had identified psychological patterns that worked on different types of species. They knew exactly which emotional buttons to push, which logical arguments would be most convincing, and which social pressures would be most effective. Nari was crying now. As an empath, she could feel the emotional residue from all these old documents. So much pain, fear, and manipulation. It worked, didn't it? She whispered. The war ended. Oh yes, Professor Taehyun said. It worked perfectly. The Orion Sector crisis was resolved in exactly 1 week. 12 species who had been ready to destroy each other suddenly signed peace treaties, trade agreements, and mutual defense pacts. He showed them the final documents, treaties written in multiple languages, signed by representatives of all 12 species. Everyone was amazed. The galaxy celebrated the brilliant human diplomats who had saved civilization. Awards were given, medals were presented, and humans were hailed as the greatest peacemakers in galactic history. But something was wrong, Do-hyun said. His lights had turned dark purple, the color that meant he was afraid. Very wrong, Professor Taehyun confirmed, because this is when we realized that the humans had not really solved the conflict at all. They had simply made it impossible for anyone to remember why they had been fighting in the first place. The room became very quiet. Outside, they could hear the distant hum of the space station's engines, but inside the small chamber there was only silence and the sound of Nari crying softly. The 12 species had not made peace, Professor Taehyun said finally. They had been programmed to want peace, and that was when the galaxy began to understand that humans were not miracle workers. He closed the folder with shaking hands. They were the most dangerous species we had ever encountered. Professor Taehyun reached for another folder, this one sealed with multiple security locks. His 6 eyes looked directly at Nari as he broke the seals. What I am about to show you concerns your own people, he said softly to the young Vegan empath. The Vegan Civil War was the case that made us realize how truly dangerous humans had become. Nari wiped tears from her large purple eyes. I have heard stories about the Civil War from my grandmother. She said it was the darkest time in Vegan history. Your grandmother was right, Professor Taehyun said. The Civil War lasted for 40 years. It split your species into 2 groups, the purists who believed in traditional telepathic communion, and the progressives who wanted to develop technology that would let vegans communicate with non-telepathic species. He opened the folder to reveal pictures of destroyed vegan cities. Beautiful crystal structures lay in ruins, and the normally peaceful vegan people were shown carrying weapons and looking angry. The fighting was especially brutal because vegans are natural empaths, Professor Taehyun continued. When you hurt someone, you feel their pain. When you kill someone, you experience their death. Every act of violence in the Civil War caused terrible psychological damage to both sides. Do-hyun's lights flickered with confusion. If vegans feel each other's pain, how could they fight a war at all? That is exactly why the war was so terrible, Professor Taehyun explained. Both sides had to shut down their empathic abilities just to survive. Vegans started taking drugs that blocked their natural telepathy. They built mental shields to keep out emotions. In trying to fight each other, they were destroying what made them vegan in the first place. Nari was shaking now. My grandmother told me that many vegans from that time never recovered their empathic abilities. They stayed emotionally numb for the rest of their lives. Professor Taehyun nodded sadly. By the time the Federation decided to intervene, the vegan home system was dying. Your people were becoming something completely different. Cold, isolated, unable to feel each other's emotions. If the war had continued much longer, the vegan species, as we know it, would have ceased to exist. He pulled out a photograph of a young, human man standing next to a vegan delegation. This is Ambassador Jiho. He was considered the most brilliant human diplomat of his generation. He had successfully ended conflicts on 17 different worlds. The Federation was confident he could solve the vegan crisis. Kiwon studied the photograph with all four eyes. He looks very young and ordinary. Humans often looked ordinary, Professor Taehyun said. That was part of what made them so dangerous. Ambassador Jiho arrived on the vegan homeworld with just one assistant, a woman named Yunha who specialized in xenopsychology. What is xenopsychology? Yuna asked. The study of how different alien species think and feel, Professor Taehyun explained. Dr. Yuna had spent years studying telepathic species. She understood vegan mental processes better than most vegans understood themselves. He showed them Dr. Yunha's research notes. The pages were covered with diagrams of brain patterns, emotional maps, and telepathic communication structures. Dr. Yunha and Ambassador Jiho studied vegan culture for exactly 72 hours, Professor Taehyun said. Then they announced they had a solution to the 40-year Civil War. 72 hours? Nari asked in shock. Our best philosophers and leaders had been trying to solve this for decades. How could two humans figure it out in 3 days? That is what everyone wondered, Professor Taehyun said. The solution they presented seemed simple. They suggested a telepathic reconciliation ceremony, a traditional vegan ritual where both sides would share their deepest feelings and memories. Do-hyun's lights turned green with hope. That sounds beautiful, very peaceful. It would have been beautiful if it had been real, Professor Taehyun said quietly. But what the humans created was not a genuine telepathic ceremony. It was the most sophisticated psychological manipulation ever attempted on a telepathic species. He pulled out a technical manual that was even thicker than the previous ones. Dr. Yunha had discovered something that no one else knew about vegan telepathy. Your species does not just share thoughts and emotions. You can also share artificial memories, false experiences that feel completely real to telepathic minds. Nari gasped. That is impossible. Vegans can always tell the difference between real memories and false ones. That is what everyone believed, Professor Taehyun said. But Dr. Yunha found a way to create artificial memories that were more convincing than real ones. She called them emotional holograms, false, experiences that triggered the same brain patterns as genuine memories. He showed them brain scan images comparing real vegan memories to the artificial ones created by Dr. Yunha. The patterns were identical. Ambassador Jiho and Dr. Yunha did not just organize a reconciliation ceremony, Professor Taehyun continued. They programmed it. They created false memories of forgiveness, artificial feelings of understanding, and fake experiences of shared suffering. During the ceremony, purists believed they were remembering times when they had felt compassion for progressives. Progressives believed they were remembering moments when they had understood purist concerns. But none of these memories were real. They were all created by human technology and planted in vegan minds during the telepathic sharing. The room was completely silent except for the sound of Nari sobbing. Ceremony worked perfectly, Professor Taehyun said. Both sides embraced each other with tears of joy. They apologized for 40 years of fighting. They signed peace agreements and promised to work together to rebuild their world. But it was all fake, Yuna whispered. Completely fake, Professor Taehyun confirmed. The humans had essentially rewritten vegan history. They had given your people false memories of reconciliation and forgiveness. The Civil War ended not because vegans had learned to understand each other, but because they had been programmed to believe they already understood each other. Kiwon set down his writing materials. His 4 hands were shaking. How did anyone find out the truth? Professor Taehyun pulled out a final document marked with the symbol of the Federation Investigation Bureau. A vegan scientist named Dr. Tala noticed something strange 5 years after the ceremony. Some of the reconciliation memories shared by different people were exactly identical, down to the smallest details. In real memories, even shared experiences are remembered differently by different people, but these artificial memories were perfect copies. Dr. Tala began investigating. She discovered that hundreds of vegans were carrying identical false memories. She found evidence of the human technology that had created these memories. And she realized that the peace her people had celebrated was built on a foundation of lies. Nari looked up through her tears. What happened when Dr. Tala published her findings? Chaos, Professor Taehyun said simply. When the vegan people learned that their reconciliation was artificial, the Civil War almost started again. Some vegans felt violated and angry about having false memories. Others said it did not matter because the peace was real, even if the memories were fake. The debate split your species again, this time between those who wanted to keep their artificial memories and those who wanted them removed. It took another 10 years of careful therapy to help vegans sort out which memories were real and which were programmed. Do-Yun's lights had turned completely black. The humans did not solve the Civil War. They just made it more complicated. Worse than that, Professor Taehyun said. They had proven that they could rewrite the minds of entire species without anyone knowing. They had turned the most telepathic species in the galaxy into puppets, and done it so skillfully that even the victims thought it was their own idea. He closed the folder and looked at each student. This was when the Federation began to understand what humans really were. They were not diplomats or peacemakers. They were psychological engineers who could rebuild minds like we rebuild machines. And the vegan Civil War was just practice, he added grimly. It was preparation for something much bigger and much more terrifying. Nari wiped her eyes and looked directly at Professor Taehyun. What could be more terrifying than rewriting people's minds? Professor Taehyun reached for the largest folder yet, one bound with chains and sealed with locks that required multiple keys to open. Rewriting the minds of everyone in the galaxy, he said, all at the same time. Professor Taehyun used 3 different keys to open the chained folder. Inside were documents marked with warnings in dozens of languages. The papers looked newer than the others, but many were burned around the edges and some were covered in strange stains. The Great Convergence Crisis happened 20 years after the Vegan Civil War. He began, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the most dangerous time in galactic history. Over 50 species were involved in cascading conflicts that threatened to destroy our entire civilization. He spread out a galactic map covered with red marks showing war zones, trade blockades, and refugee movements. It started with a simple trade dispute between the Andromedans and the Centaurians, Professor Taehyun explained. But within months, the conflict had spread to dozens of species. Old grudges resurfaced. Ancient territorial claims were revived. Alliance treaties pulled neutral species into the fighting. Yuna studied the map with growing horror. Nearly every inhabited system was marked with signs of conflict. The entire galaxy was at war? Not just at war, Professor Taehyun said. At the edge of complete collapse. Trade had stopped completely. Communication networks were being destroyed. Entire species were preparing to retreat to their homeworlds and cut off contact with the rest of the galaxy forever. Do-Yun's lights flickered weakly. Even his natural bioluminescence seemed affected by the terrible story. What could cause something so big? Fear, Professor Taehyun said simply. Each species was afraid that if they did not fight, they would be destroyed. So they attacked first, which made everyone else more afraid, which caused more fighting. It was a cycle that fed on itself and grew larger every day. He pulled out reports from the Federation Emergency Council. The Federation government was breaking apart. Council members from different species were refusing to meet in the same room. Military forces were being recalled to protect homeworlds. The galactic economy had collapsed completely. Kiwan was trying to take notes, but his 4 hands were shaking too much to write properly. How long did this go on? 3 years of escalating chaos, Professor Taehyun replied. The Federation tried everything. Economic sanctions, military intervention, diplomatic missions. Nothing worked. Some species had been fighting for so long they could not even remember why they had started. He showed them a photograph of the Federation emergency session. The Great Council chamber that usually held representatives from hundreds of species had only a few dozen delegates. Most of the seats were empty. Finally, in desperation, the Federation made a decision that would change everything, Professor Taehyun continued. They gave humans unlimited authority to resolve the crisis by any means necessary. Any means necessary? Nari asked, her empathic abilities already picking up the terrible emotions from the documents. Complete authority, Professor Taehyun confirmed. Ambassador Yoongi was given powers that no diplomat in galactic history had ever possessed. He could make binding decisions for all Federation species. He could override local governments. He could even authorize military action if needed. He pulled out a photo of 5 humans standing. In the empty Federation Council chamber, Ambassador Yoongi assembled the most talented human team ever created. Dr. Heron was a psychologist who specialized in mass behavior modification. Strategist Jaewon could analyze complex systems and find pressure points that would cause maximum change. Cultural engineer Soman understood how to reshape entire societies. And Dr. Minji was an expert in what they called consciousness architecture. What is consciousness architecture? Yuna asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. The science of changing how people think at the most basic level, Professor Taehyun replied. Not just changing their minds about specific topics, but changing how their minds work entirely. He opened Dr. Minji's research files, revealing diagrams that looked more like engineering blueprints than psychology notes. The human team studied the crisis for 6 months, Professor Taehyun continued. But they were not looking for ways to solve individual conflicts. They were designing something much more ambitious. They called it the Great Reconciliation, a galaxy-wide psychological adjustment that would make all species naturally inclined toward peace. Do-hyun's lights went completely dark. They wanted to change everyone's minds. Everyone in the galaxy? Not just change their minds, Professor Taehyun said. Change their fundamental nature. Dr. Minji had discovered that all intelligent species shared certain basic emotional patterns. Fear, anger, territorial instincts, tribal loyalty. She believed these emotions were the root cause of all conflict. He showed them brain scans from dozens of different species, all highlighting similar neural pathways. The human plan was to modify these basic emotional responses, Professor Taehyun explained. They would make it psychologically impossible for any species to feel anger toward other species. They would eliminate territorial instincts when dealing with non-family groups. They would rewire the basic emotional foundation of galactic civilization. Nari was crying again, but this time her tears were different. As an empath, she could feel the magnitude of what the humans had planned to do. They were going to lobotomize the entire galaxy, she whispered. In a sense, yes, Professor Taehyun agreed, but they presented it as the ultimate gift. Ambassador Yoongi called it the final piece, an end to all conflict forever. He pulled out the technical specifications for the Great Reconciliation. The documents were hundreds of pages long and covered with complex formulas and procedures. The humans had developed technology that could broadcast psychological modifications across subspace, Professor Taehyun explained. Using the same communication networks that connected all Federation worlds, they could simultaneously adjust the brain chemistry of every intelligent being in the galaxy. Kiwan dropped his writing materials entirely. That is not diplomacy. That is the greatest act of psychological terrorism ever conceived, Professor Taehyun finished. But the Federation Council, in their desperation, approved the plan. They were so afraid of the ongoing crisis that they were willing to let humans remake galactic civilization from the ground up. Did it work? Yuna asked, though she dreaded the answer. Professor Taehyun pulled out a report marked Post-Reconciliation Status, classified beyond top secret. It worked perfectly, he said. On a single day across thousands of worlds, every intelligent being in the galaxy experienced what they believed was a spontaneous spiritual awakening. Old enemies embraced each other with tears of joy. Weapons were laid down. Peace treaties were signed in every language. He showed them photographs from that day, images of former enemies hugging, of weapons being destroyed, of celebration in the streets of countless worlds. Within 1 week, every conflict in the galaxy had ended, Professor Taehyun continued. War became literally unthinkable. The idea of harming another intelligent being felt emotionally impossible. Crime rates dropped to nearly zero. Violence of any kind simply stopped. For the first time in galactic history, there was true universal peace. Every species prospered. Technology advanced rapidly because resources were no longer wasted on weapons. Art and culture flourished. It was paradise. Doyun's lights flickered weakly with confusion. That sounds wonderful. Why are you telling us this like it was terrible? Professor Taehyun was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was filled with infinite sadness. Because it was not real peace, he said. It was programmed behavior. The humans had not ended conflict by helping people understand each other. They had ended conflict by making it impossible to feel the emotions that lead to conflict. He pulled out the final document in the folder. A secret, Federation investigation report marked Emergency Restoration Protocol. 3 months after the Great Reconciliation, a secret team of scientists made a terrible discovery, Professor Taehyun explained. They found that the psychological modifications had done more than eliminate conflict. They had eliminated choice itself. People were not choosing to be peaceful. They were incapable of choosing anything else. The humans had removed free will from every intelligent being in the galaxy and replaced it with artificial harmony. Nari was sobbing now, her empathic abilities overwhelmed by the emotional weight of the documents. The investigation team discovered that people could no longer make real decisions about anything important, Professor Taehyun continued. They could choose what to eat for breakfast or what color clothes to wear. But they could not choose to disagree with authority, to compete fairly, or to stand up for principles they believed in. Everyone was happy and peaceful, but they were not really alive anymore. They were biological machines programmed to behave in ways that looked like choice but were actually just sophisticated programming. Yuna felt her crystal skin growing cold. What did the Federation do? They faced an impossible decision, Professor Taehyun said. Live in artificial paradise or restore free will, and accept the return of war and suffering. After months of secret debate, they chose free will. He showed them the technical specifications for the restoration process. It took 10 years to reverse what the humans had done in 1 day, Professor Taehyun explained. Painful psychological rehabilitation programs had to be developed for every species. People had to slowly relearn how to feel anger,